My father had always been good at making generosity feel like a debt you could never finish paying off. I was 28, standing in the gravel driveway of the mountain cabin near Asheville with a duffel bag digging into my shoulder, when Anthony Wells let the first real crack show in everything I thought I knew about my family. Anthony had driven up with my father and stepmother because his own car was in the shop again. He was the kind of family friend who had been around since I was in high school, the one who showed up for holidays and never quite left the group chat. I had just set my bag down on the porch steps when he came around the side of the truck with a case of beer and said it like he was making small talk. "Tim said you finally agreed to sign off on that old arrangement," Anthony said, shifting the beer to his other hand. "About time, right? He told me you understood the family had to come first again, especially after everything he did to help you get on your feet back then." I kept my face still. The wind coming off the mountains was cold for early summer, but that was not what made my stomach tighten. My father had never called any of it an arrangement. He had called it helping his daughter when she needed it most. 5 years ago, when the family business had taken a hit and I had just started my first real job, I had emptied most of my savings to cover payroll for 3 months. I had done it because he asked and because I still believed that was what family did. No one had ever written it down as a loan. No one had ever said I would owe it back in any form except love and loyalty. Anthony kept talking, oblivious. He said once the paperwork's done this week, everything evens out and we can all stop worrying about money for a while. "Smart move on your part, kid." I nodded once, the way you do when your brain is still catching up to your ears. "Right," I said. "Wouldn't want anyone worrying." My stepmother Sandra came out onto the porch then, wiping her hands on a dish towel even though we had not unpacked anything yet. She gave Anthony one of her warm, practiced smiles. "You telling stories already?" she asked, but her eyes flicked to me for half a second longer than necessary. Anthony laughed. "Just catching up. Amanda knows how it is." I did not know how it was. Not anymore. If you have ever watched someone rewrite your own history right in front of you and smile while they did it, you know why I did not explode on that porch. I picked up my bag, told Anthony the beer could go in the fridge, and walked inside the cabin like nothing had shifted. But something had. The mountain air suddenly felt thinner. My older brother Kevin was already in the kitchen unpacking groceries my father must have bought on the way up. Kevin was 32, the one who had stayed close to the family business and never needed to borrow or lend anything dramatic. He glanced over his shoulder when I came in. "You made it," he said. "Dad was starting to think you were bailing again." "Traffic," I answered. That was a lie. I had left early on purpose, wanting one quiet hour before the rest of them arrived. So much for that. My father came in from the back deck a minute later, carrying a stack of firewood even though it was June. He dropped it by the stone fireplace and looked at me like he was checking inventory. "Amanda," he said. My name sounded like a line item. "You brought the folder I asked for?" I had. He had texted 3 days earlier asking me to bring the old bank statements from the year the business almost folded. I had thought it was for taxes. Now I was not sure what it was for. "It's in my bag," I said. "Good. We'll go over it after dinner. Sandra made that casserole you like." Sandra smiled from the kitchen like she had won a prize. My cousin Rachel was supposed to arrive the next day with my Aunt Dorothy. The cabin was big enough for all of us for 2 weeks. I had been looking forward to it in the way you look forward to something that might still be normal. That version of the trip was already gone. I carried my bag upstairs to the room I always took, the one with the window that faced the trees instead of the driveway. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed for a long minute. Anthony's words kept circling. Everything he did to help you get on your feet back then. Once the paperwork's done this week. My father had never asked me to sign anything before. He had asked for money, and I had given it. Now it sounded like that money had become leverage. I pulled out my phone and opened the group chat the family used for these trips. There were already messages from the drive up. Nothing unusual until I saw one from my father to the whole group that had been sent an hour earlier. Anthony's riding with us. Amanda's bringing the old statements. Should be able to get everything sorted before the weekend. Appreciate everyone staying on the same page about the family priorities. It was ordinary enough on the surface. But the phrase staying on the same page about the family priorities had never appeared in any previous trip chat. It felt like a warning dressed up as coordination. I put the phone face down on the quilt. Outside the window, the mountains were turning purple in the late light. I could hear my father and Anthony laughing on the deck below, the low sound of Sandra moving around the kitchen, Kevin's voice asking where the extra towels were. It all sounded exactly like every other year we had done this. Except now I knew the laughter might be covering something else. I stood up, opened the closet to hang a few things, and noticed an old cardboard box on the top shelf. It had been there for years, the kind of box nobody ever opened because it was full of old photo albums and random papers from when the cabin was first bought. I reached up and pulled it down without thinking, just needing something to do with my hands. The first album I opened was from the year I was 12. There were pictures of all of us on the same deck, younger and sunburned. I flipped through them slowly, the way you do when you are trying not to think about the present. Near the back, between two loose photos, was a folded piece of notebook paper that did not belong there. I opened it. It was dated 5 years ago, the same year I had drained my savings. My father's handwriting, the same tight script he used for business notes. It was not addressed to anyone. It just said, "Talk to Amanda today." She agreed to cover the shortfall. No need to put it in writing yet. She trusts family. We'll revisit terms once the business stabilizes. Sandra thinks we should keep a record anyway in case she forgets what she owes. I read it twice. The paper was thin and the creases were soft from being folded and unfolded. My hand stayed steady, but the sarcastic little voice in the back of my head started up immediately. Of course he wrote it down for himself. Of course my stepmother wanted the record. Of course the version where I simply helped because they asked was never the real one. I folded the note exactly the way I had found it and slipped it into the inside pocket of my jacket. Then I put the album back in the box and returned the box to the shelf like nothing had happened. Downstairs someone turned on music. My father's voice carried up the stairs, warm and easy, asking Anthony if he wanted the first beer. I sat back down on the bed and looked at my phone again. The group chat had one new message while I was upstairs. It was from my stepmother to my father, but it had gone to the whole thread by mistake. Anthony almost said too much on the drive. Amanda looked like she caught it. We still need her signature before we can move the accounts. Keep it light tonight. We can talk terms tomorrow when Dorothy and Rachel get here and everyone's in a good mood. I stared at the screen until the words stopped moving. Then I locked the phone and set it on the nightstand. They were not even trying to hide it from each other. They were just trying to hide it from me long enough to get the signature. I stood up, checked my reflection in the small mirror over the dresser, and made sure my expression was the same one I had worn on the porch. Calm. A little tired from the drive. Nothing worth noticing. If my father wanted to treat 5 years of my money and trust like a line item he could call due whenever it suited him, he was going to have to work harder. Then a mistaken text and a note shoved in an old box. I opened the bedroom door and headed back downstairs. The cabin smelled like Sandra's casserole and wood smoke from the fireplace someone had already lit even though it was not cold enough yet. My father looked up when I reached the bottom step and smiled like he always did. Perfect timing, he said. Dinner's ready. I smiled back. It felt thin on my face, but he did not seem to notice. Great, I answered. I'm starving. The dinner tasted like cardboard even though Sandra had made the casserole the way she always did, with the extra cheese on top. My father kept the conversation light, asking Anthony about his latest project and teasing Kevin about still being single. I passed the bread when it came around and laughed at the right moments, but the note in my jacket pocket felt heavier with every bite. Anthony's slip on the porch and that mistaken text were sitting in my stomach like stones. Later, when everyone drifted off to their rooms, I stayed in the living room pretending to scroll on my phone. The fire had burned down to embers. My father came back downstairs for a glass of water and paused when he saw me still up. "You look tired," he said. "Long drive?" "Long enough," I answered. I kept my voice even. "You said you wanted those old statements tomorrow?" He nodded like it was the most normal request in the world. Patrick Dunn put together some paperwork. "Nothing complicated. Just needs your signature so we can clean up the old accounts and move forward as a family. You helped us once. This is just making it official." There it was again. The quiet rewrite. My past help turned into something I now owed him for. I gave him a small smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Sure," I said. "We can look at it tomorrow." He seemed satisfied with that and went back upstairs. I waited until the cabin was completely quiet before I went back to the old box in the upstairs closet. This time I emptied it onto the floor of my room, careful not to make noise. Most of it was the usual junk, faded vacation photos, old receipts, a couple of broken fishing lures. Near the bottom, tucked inside a worn hardcover copy of some business book my father must have left here years ago, was another piece of paper. It was a single sheet torn from a legal pad. My father's handwriting again, but this one had dates and numbers. It listed the amount I had given 5 years ago, then added what looked like interest calculated at some made-up rate. At the bottom it said, in his neat block letters, "Amanda understands family obligations. Will sign when asked. Sandra agrees we keep this between us until the timing is right." I sat on the floor with the paper in my lap and let out a quiet, bitter laugh that no one else could hear. They had turned my help into a debt with interest, written it down like a business note, and then acted like I was the one who might forget. The sarcasm in my own head was sharp enough to cut. Of course my stepmother wanted it documented. Of course my father had planned to bring it up when it suited him. Respect had never been part of the equation. Only leverage. I folded both notes and slid them into the inside pocket of my suitcase, underneath my clothes. Then I put everything else back exactly as it had been. If they wanted to play this like a quiet business deal, I could at least make sure I had the receipts. The next 2 days moved in that strange cabin rhythm where everything looks normal on the surface. We hiked a short trail in the morning, made big breakfasts, and sat on the deck in the afternoons. My father and Anthony played cards. Sandra and Kevin talked about the business. I stayed mostly quiet and watched. Every time the subject of family priorities or cleaning up old accounts came up, my father's eyes would flick toward me for a second too long. Sandra would smile and change the subject like she was protecting a secret we all already knew. On the third morning, my phone buzzed with another message that had clearly been meant for a smaller group. It was from my stepmother to my father and Kevin, but it had gone to the whole thread again. "Patrick says the signature page needs to be notarized. We can do it here at the cabin when Dorothy and Rachel arrive Friday. Keep Amanda relaxed until then. No need to push too hard. Yet." I read it 3 times. Then I screenshotted it and saved it to a folder I had started on my phone. They were not even being careful anymore. Or maybe they had been this careless for years and I had simply trusted them enough not to notice. My older brother Kevin found me on the deck later that afternoon, staring at the mountains. He sat down in the chair next to mine with a beer and didn't say anything for a minute. "Dad's been stressed about the business," he said eventually. "This trip is supposed to be about relaxing, but you know how he gets when things are up in the air." I kept looking at the trees. "And how does he get?" Kevin shrugged. "He wants everyone on the same page. You helped before. He figures you'll help again. It's not that big a deal. There it was. Even my brother had been pulled into the narrative. The past help turned into a permanent obligation. I gave him the same thin smile I had been using since I arrived. Right, I said. Family first. He seemed relieved that I had not argued and went back inside. I stayed on the deck until the light started to fade. The sarcasm was starting to feel like armor. They really believed that because I had given once, I would keep giving forever, and that asking for my signature was just a formality. My Aunt Dorothy and Cousin Rachel were supposed to arrive the next afternoon. I spent the morning helping Sandra with lunch prep while my father and Anthony went into town for more supplies. Sandra kept the conversation easy, asking about my job and whether I was seeing anyone. I answered on autopilot. Every time she said we when talking about the family, it landed differently now. After lunch, when everyone else went down to the small creek behind the cabin, I went back upstairs and opened my laptop. I logged into the old shared drive we had used years ago for family documents. Most of it was password protected now, but one folder was still open. Inside were scanned copies of the original transfer I had made 5 years ago and a new document Patrick Dunn had apparently prepared. It was a simple-looking agreement that transferred decision-making rights on a portion of family assets to my father and stepmother, with a note at the bottom that my earlier contribution would be credited as part of the arrangement. They had turned my money into a bargaining chip for control. Quiet. Clean. No raised voices. Just paperwork and the steady pressure of family. I closed the laptop and sat there for a long time. The cabin was quiet except for the sound of the wind in the trees. I could hear faint laughter from down by the creek. My cousin Rachel would be here tomorrow. My Aunt Dorothy too. I wondered how many of them already knew the version of the story where I owed my father something. My phone lit up with another message. This one was from my father to the full group chat, including the people who had not arrived yet. Looking forward to having everyone together tomorrow. We'll handle the small bit of family business first thing so we can enjoy the rest of the weekend. Amanda, make sure you have those statements handy. I stared at the screen. They were not even pretending it was optional anymore. The timeline had moved up. They wanted it done before the weekend was over, with the rest of the family as witnesses, so it would feel like a done deal. I put the phone down and walked over to the window. The mountains looked peaceful in the late afternoon light. I had come here expecting 2 weeks of the same old cabin routine. Instead, I had found proof that my father and stepmother had been keeping score for years and planned to collect in the form of my signature and whatever control came with it. I was not going to give it to them easily. But I also knew that once I pushed back, the version of this family that pretended everything was fine would be gone. The illusion of unconditional support was already cracking. I just had not decided yet how much of it I was willing to shatter myself. Downstairs the front door opened and my father's voice carried up the stairs, cheerful and loud, asking if anyone wanted to start the grill. I took a slow breath, checked that the notes were still safe in my suitcase, and headed down to join them like everything was normal. It was not normal. And they were going to find that out soon enough. The grill was all ready. Smoking when I reached the bottom of the stairs. My father stood at it with a pair of tongs, telling Anthony some story about a client who had tried to lowball him years ago. Sandra was setting the table on the deck. Kevin was bringing out plates. Everything looked exactly like the cabin trips we had taken for most of my life. The only difference was that I now knew the version they had been telling themselves about me. My Aunt Dorothy and Cousin Rachel arrived the next afternoon, right on schedule. Dorothy hugged me a little longer than usual and said I looked thin. Rachel, who was 24 and still finishing her degree, dropped her bag and immediately started asking about the hiking trails. I smiled and answered them both. Inside, I was counting down to the moment my father would bring up the small bit of family business. It came after dinner on Friday night. We were still sitting around the big wooden table on the deck when my father set his glass down and cleared his throat. "Since we're all here," he said, "we might as well take care of that paperwork Patrick put together." Amanda brought the old statements. "It won't take more than 10 minutes. Sandra nodded like this was the most natural thing in the world. "We've been meaning to clean up the old accounts for a while. This just makes everything official." Kevin stayed quiet but didn't look surprised. Anthony suddenly found his beer very interesting. Dorothy frowned slightly but didn't speak. Rachel glanced between all of us, sensing the shift in the air. I kept my hands flat on the table. "What exactly does the paperwork say?" My father gave me the patient smile he used when he thought someone was being difficult. "It just acknowledges your earlier contribution and moves some decision rights to me and Sandra so we can handle things efficiently going forward. You helped the family once. This is the family helping itself now." There it was. The weapon, polished and ready. My past help turned into a permanent claim on my future. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the 2 folded notes I had found in the old box. I set them on the table between the plates and the serving dishes. "These were in the cabin," I said. "One from the year I gave the money. One with interest calculations you added later. You wrote that I understood family obligations and that Sandra wanted it documented in case I forgot what I owed." The table went quiet. My father's smile tightened. Sandra's face went still in a way that made her look older. "Those are old notes," my father said after a moment. "Context matters, Amanda. You were young. We were trying to protect everyone." "Protect everyone by turning my savings into a debt with interest you invented?" I asked. The sarcasm came out before I could soften it. "And then planning to get my signature while the rest of the family was here so it would feel like a group decision?" Rachel leaned forward. "What signature?" My father ignored her. He looked straight at me. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be. We're family. Families help each other and then they move on." "Except you never moved on," I said. "You kept score. And now you want me to sign something that gives you control over assets I didn't even know were still tied to that old transfer." Patrick Dunn's document was still on my laptop. I had not printed it, but I did not need to. The notes on the table were enough. Dorothy finally spoke, her voice careful. "Timothy, if there are written records you kept from Amanda without telling her, that changes the conversation." My father's jaw tightened. He had not expected pushback from his sister. Sandra jumped in, her tone sharp. "This is between Amanda and her father. The rest of you don't need to get involved in old family matters." Rachel looked at Sandra, then at me. Something in her expression shifted. She had always been the quiet one at these trips, the one who stayed out of the adult conversations. Now she sat up straighter. "I think we do get involved," Rachel said. "Because if this is how the family works, I want to know before I get asked to sign anything later." The words landed like a small explosion. My father turned to her, genuinely surprised. Kevin shifted in his chair but still said nothing. Anthony kept his eyes on his plate. Dorothy reached over and put her hand on Rachel's arm, a quiet show of support. My father recovered quickly. He looked back at me, the charm sliding back into place like it always did. "Amanda, you're upset. I get it. But walking away from this now would hurt the whole family. We built this together. Your contribution was part of that. Signing just closes the loop." I let the sarcasm sit in my voice, clear and cold. "Closing the loop by giving you power over decisions I should have had a say in from the beginning? No thanks." I stood up. The chair scraped against the deck boards. Everyone watched me. "I'm not signing anything," I said. "Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever, unless I decide the terms are fair and I actually trust the people asking. Right now I don't." My father's face hardened. You're choosing to make this difficult. I'm choosing to stop pretending this was ever about family, I answered. It was about control. And I'm done handing it over. I walked inside, packed my bag in under 10 minutes, and came back out with it over my shoulder. The deck was still silent. Rachel stood up when she saw me. You don't have to leave, she said quietly. I can drive back with you if you want. The offer was small and it cost her something. I saw it in the way my father's expression tightened further and in the way Kevin looked away. Dorothy gave me a small nod, the closest thing to an apology she could offer without starting a war she was not ready for. I appreciate that, I told Rachel. But I think I need to go alone. I hugged her quickly, then Dorothy. I did not hug my father or Sandra or Kevin. Anthony still would not meet my eyes. I walked down the steps to my car without looking back. The drive down the mountain was dark and quiet. I kept both hands on the wheel and let the sarcasm and the grief sit side by side in my chest. They had turned my willingness to help into a chain they could pull whenever they needed something. And when I finally saw the chain, they acted like I was the one breaking the family. I had not won anything dramatic. My father and stepmother would almost certainly keep doing what they had always done with the rest of the family. Kevin would probably stay close to them. Dorothy might call me in a few weeks with careful questions. Rachel might text. But the easy version of us, the one where showing up meant unconditional support, was gone. I had traded that illusion for the ability to sleep at night without wondering what new obligation they were writing down about me. 2 weeks later I was back in my own apartment, sorting through my mail. There was a thick envelope from Patrick Dunn's office. Inside was a formal letter stating that my father was moving forward with restructuring the family accounts without my signature and that any prior contributions would be treated as gifts rather than loans. They had already rewritten the story again, this time in legal language that protected them. I read it once, then dropped it in the recycling bin without replying. My phone lit up with a text from Rachel. It was just a single line, "You okay? Aunt Dorothy asked about you." I typed back, "Getting there. Thanks for asking." That was all. I did not need more from her right now. I was learning that sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is stop waiting for people to give you respect they have already shown they do not have. My father never called to apologize. Sandra sent one short message 2 months later asking if I was still upset about the cabin thing. I did not answer. Kevin liked a photo I posted online but never reached out directly. The silence was its own kind of answer. I still think about that mountain cabin sometimes, especially on nights when I catch myself missing the version of my family I used to believe in. The one where help was just help and no one kept score in the back of an old book. That version never really existed. I just stopped pretending it did. If you have ever had someone turn the things you gave freely into a debt they could call in whenever it suited them, you know how quiet the breaking point can be. It does not always happen in a screaming match. Sometimes it happens over casserole on a deck while everyone else pretends not to notice. I chose myself that night on the mountain. It cost me the easy version of family and the illusion that love and respect were automatic. Some days that still feels like a loss. Most days it feels like the only honest choice I had left. Thank you for listening to my story. If this sounded familiar, drop truth in the comments and tell me what you would have done when the notes and the text started adding up. I read every single one.